In May of 2013, the Serbian army carried 4 coffins into a small hilltop church in the town of Topola and buried them with full state honors, guns saluting, a patriarch presiding, the president standing at attention. That part isn't strange. Countries bury their dead with dignity all the time. Here's what's strange. The government doing the burying was the direct institutional descendant of the government that had spent nearly 70 years insisting these people didn't belong in Serbia at all. The man in the lead coffin was once king of Yugoslavia. He died stateless, in exile, in the United States, in 1970. For over 40 years, his body lay in a monastery basement in Illinois, the only European monarch ever buried on American soil, not by choice, but because there was nowhere else for him to go. And now here he was, home, with a state funeral, in a country whose government had once made it a crime to even say his family's name with respect. That's contradiction number 1. Here's contradiction number 2, and it's stranger. Buried in that same royal crypt is a man history spent decades calling a traitor, a regent who signed a pact with Nazi Germany, was overthrown in a coup, hustled out of the country by the very British government that had been his ally, and left to rot in reputation for the rest of his life. He too got the flag, the honor guard, the patriarch's blessing. The nation that once erased him gave him a hero's welcome home. So here's the question this story actually needs to answer, and it isn't what happened to the royal family. Royal families lose thrones all the time. The real question is, how do you go from being erased by decree, from having your name made unspeakable in your own country, to being carried home under a flag with a full military escort? What does a nation have to decide, and when, and why, to reverse a verdict that lasted 7 decades? To understand that, you have to go back before the coffins, before the exile, before even the war that caused it, back to a rebellion against an empire in 1804, because that's where this family's name comes from, and it's the reason erasing them was never going to be simple. You also have to understand something. This story refuses to simplify. Not everyone in that royal crypt is remembered the same way. Even now, one of the men buried there is, by most accounts, a straightforward national figure who lost everything defending his country's independence against invasion. The other is one of the most disputed figures in 20th century Balkan history, a man some historians still call a collaborator, and others call the only adult in the room trying to keep his country out of a war it could not survive. Serbia buried both of them with the same honors. Whether that's reconciliation or a nation simply tired of arguing with its own past is a question we're going to sit with, not answer, because the honest record doesn't give us a clean answer to hand you. 2 funerals, 7 decades apart from the events that caused them. 1 king who did nothing wrong except lose a war he never chose to fight. 1 regent who may or may not deserve the label history gave him, and a country that, eventually, decided to bring them both home anyway. Let's start at the beginning, with an uprising, a poplar tree, and a name that would end up meaning something to Serbians for the next 200 years. The name Karađorđević comes from a man, not a place. Karađorđe, Black George, was a Serbian revolutionary leader who, in 1804, organized an uprising against the Ottoman Empire and made it stick, at least for a while. The first Serbian uprising didn't immediately produce an independent Serbia, and Karađorđe himself would eventually be assassinated by a domestic rival. But the uprising cracked something open that never fully closed again, the idea that Ottoman rule wasn't permanent, and that Serbs with the right leadership could challenge an empire and survive the attempt. That matters because the Karađorđević name was never just a royal brand. It was tied to the founding myth of modern Serbian statehood itself. When later Karađorđević sat on the throne of Serbia, and then of the larger state that would become Yugoslavia, they were inheriting a story about resistance that predated the monarchy by over a century. That's a big part of why, decades later, a communist government trying to erase this family from Serbian life would find the job harder than it looked. You can abolish an office. Erasing a founding story is a different task entirely. By the early 20th century, the Karađorđević dynasty ruled the Kingdom of Serbia, and then, after the First World War, a brand new and considerably larger state, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later renamed the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, an ambitious attempt to unite South Slavic peoples with different languages, religions, and centuries of separate history under a single crown, held together partly by force of will and partly by the personal authority of the monarch himself. That monarch, through the 1920s and into the 1930s, was King Alexander I, who had led Serbian forces in the First World War and, in the eyes of many subjects, earned the throne through wartime leadership rather than simply inheriting it. But holding Yugoslavia together was a constant, grinding project. Croatian nationalists chafed against what they saw as Serbian domination of the new state, and by the early 1930s, Alexander responded to years of political deadlock by suspending the constitution and ruling as a personal dictator, hoping centralized royal authority could hold together what parliamentary politics could not. That dictatorship wasn't popular with everyone, and it created real enemies, some well-organized, some well-funded from outside Yugoslavia's borders. Croatian separatists and Macedonian revolutionary nationalists both had reasons to want the king gone, and by the mid-1930s, at least one of those groups had moved from grievance to active planning. None of that instability was visible on the surface in October of 1934, when King Alexander traveled to France on a state visit, an ordinary piece of royal diplomacy meant to shore up alliances in an increasingly dangerous Europe. He landed at Marseille, was met with a state welcome, and within minutes of stepping into an open car to be driven through the crowded streets, everything about the Karađorđević dynasty's trajectory changed, permanently. We'll get to exactly what happened on that street next, because the assassination in Marseille is the hinge point that put a child on the throne, put a regent in charge who history still can't agree on, and set in motion the chain of decisions that would, 7 years later, tear this entire family out of its own country. Right up until 1934, this was a monarchy that had built its legitimacy on a 200-year-old story of resistance to foreign domination, now sitting atop a fragile multi-ethnic state held together largely by one man's personal authority. That man was about to be killed in public, on camera, in front of an allied nation's government, and the family had no real plan for what came next. King Alexander landed in Marseille on the 9th of October 1934 on what was supposed to be routine alliance-building diplomacy with France. He traveled in an open car alongside French Foreign Minister Louis Barthou, moving slowly through crowded streets, the kind of event that happens with bureaucratic regularity in the life of a 20th-century monarch, except this one had already been flagged, internally, as a security risk that French authorities had underestimated. The assassin was Vlado Chernomyrsky, a trained marksman with ties to Macedonian revolutionary nationalist networks, operating in coordination with Croatian ultranationalist exiles who wanted Alexander dead for their own reasons. As the motorcade slowed near the Bourse, Chernomyrsky forced his way close to the vehicle and opened fire. Alexander was hit multiple times and died almost immediately. Barthou was also killed in the chaotic aftermath, struck by a stray bullet, turning a Yugoslav tragedy into a diplomatic crisis for France as well. Chernomyrsky was killed on the spot by mounted police and enraged bystanders, meaning the man who pulled the trigger would never stand trial, and the full extent of who else was involved in planning the assassination was never fully resolved through legal process. That matters, while the broad outline, who shot Alexander, and that it was carried out by Macedonian and Croatian nationalist networks acting together, is well documented. Exactly how coordinated, how funded, and how officially sanctioned the plot was has been argued over by historians for decades. The assassin's death didn't close the book. It left several chapters permanently unwritten. What's not in dispute is the immediate consequence. Alexander's heir, Crown Prince Peter, was 11 years old, too young to govern a fractured multi-ethnic kingdom that had just lost the one figure holding competing factions in an uneasy balance. Under Alexander's will, a three-man regency council would rule in the young king's name, but the dominant figure among the three, the man who would effectively run the country for the next 7 years, was Alexander's cousin, Prince Paul Karađorđević. Paul was, by most accounts, a sophisticated, Oxford-educated aristocrat, far more comfortable in the art galleries of Western Europe than in Balkan power politics. He hadn't sought the position. Nothing in his background as an art collector and diplomat's favorite dinner guest had trained him for what he was about to be handed, at a moment when Europe was sliding toward a second catastrophic war. He was a compromise regent, chosen partly because the family trusted him, and partly because there was no better option in the wings. For the next several years, his job was an impossible balancing act: keep a fragile multi-ethnic kingdom from tearing itself apart internally, while keeping it out of the crosshairs of an increasingly aggressive Nazi Germany on one border and a hostile fascist Italy on another, without the military or economic strength to resist either if it came to open confrontation. For a while, remarkably, he managed it. Yugoslavia stayed formally neutral through the war's opening years, even as neighboring states were absorbed or coerced into alliance with the Axis one by one. But neutrality has a shelf life for a small, strategically located country between two aggressive great powers, and by early 1941, that shelf life was running out fast. Germany wanted Yugoslavia's cooperation, or at minimum its non-interference, for an upcoming Balkan campaign, and Paul was about to be forced into the single most consequential and most historically contested decision of his life. On the 25th of March 1941, under enormous pressure from Berlin, Paul's government signed the Tripartite Pact, formally aligning Yugoslavia with Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. It's important to be precise about what this was. Not a declaration of war, not a commitment of Yugoslav troops. In the narrowest legal sense, it was closer to an agreement of non-aggression and limited cooperation, designed, by Paul's own later defense, specifically to avoid a German invasion Yugoslavia had no realistic way of resisting on its own. Whether that was defensible strategy or moral capitulation is exactly the kind of question this documentary can't responsibly answer for you. What we can tell you is what happened next, because it happened fast and publicly. 2 days after the pact was signed, on the 27th of March, pro-Western anti-Axis officers in the Royal Yugoslav Air Force staged a coup d'etat in Belgrade, seizing key buildings overnight, arresting ministers loyal to Paul's regency, and declaring 17-year-old King Peter II to have come of age immediately, so a legitimate monarch, not a discredited regent, would be on the throne when the announcement went out. Crowds gathered in Belgrade the following day, and by most accounts a substantial portion of the public genuinely welcomed the coup, real anger at the pact, real relief at seeing Paul removed. Paul did not resist. He was placed under British-arranged exile almost immediately, sent first toward Greece and eventually to Kenya, then a British colonial territory, where he'd remained confined and cut off from political life for years. Within 48 hours of signing a pact meant to keep Yugoslavia safe from invasion, the man who signed it had been removed from power entirely. And here's the brutal irony. The coup that removed Paul didn't actually save Yugoslavia from the thing he'd been trying to avoid. If anything, it triggered it. Hitler reportedly viewed the Belgrade coup as a personal humiliation on Germany's southeastern flank, at a moment when German planning was already deep into preparations for invading the Soviet Union and needed the Balkans secured first. Within days, Hitler ordered the immediate, punitive invasion and dismantling of Yugoslavia, not simply an occupation but a deliberate destruction of the state, to be carried out with maximum speed. Language in the surviving German military directive is often translated as calling for merciless harshness. On the 6th of April 1941, Germany launched a coordinated invasion, opening with a heavy bombing campaign against Belgrade that killed thousands of civilians in a single day, followed by ground forces supported by Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops moving in to claim their own portions of Yugoslav territory. The Royal Yugoslav Army, poorly equipped and facing overwhelming air superiority, began collapsing almost immediately. This was not a slow campaign. It was a demolition. 17-year-old Peter II, on the throne barely a week and a half, tried alongside his government to organize a defense of a country disintegrating faster than any coordinated response could be mounted. Yugoslav military resistance formally collapsed within roughly 11 days of the invasion beginning, an almost unthinkably short span for a country of Yugoslavia's size to hold out. The government chose to evacuate rather than surrender in place, understanding that capture would hand Germany a propaganda victory and eliminate any chance of a government in exile continuing to represent Yugoslav sovereignty abroad. Peter II left by air, making his way through a chaotic series of moves across the Mediterranean and Middle East, to Britain, where he'd spend the war as the internationally recognized head of a government in exile with no territory left to govern. So here's the full shape of what happened in barely 2 weeks. On the 25th of March, a regent signed a pact to keep his country out of war. On the 27th, he was overthrown by officers who believed that pact was a betrayal. On the 6th of April, the invasion the coup was supposed to prevent happened anyway, launched specifically as retaliation for the coup. And within roughly 11 days after that, the kingdom Peter II had just inherited had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning, unoccupied state, meaning he held genuine authority over his own country for a period measured in days, not years. That precision matters, because it's the only way to see the trap this family was caught in. Paul tried the cautious path and was overthrown for it. Peter's government tried the defiant path and was invaded within days, specifically because of that defiance. There was no version of this decision tree, with the resources Yugoslavia actually had in March of 1941, that led anywhere but catastrophe. That doesn't settle who made the right call. It does mean any version of this story that frames either side as simply making an obvious mistake is skipping past how narrow, and how genuinely without good options, the actual choice was. What we know with certainty is the outcome: a kingdom destroyed, a 17-year-old king turned into a head of state with no state to head, and a former regent exiled to a British colonial outpost, about to spend the rest of his life carrying a reputation that would take Serbia nearly 7 decades to formally reconsider. Let's be precise about what actually happened to Paul after the coup, because the popular shorthand, Nazi collaborator, exiled in disgrace, compresses a genuinely complicated situation into a label that doesn't hold up well under close examination, even as it doesn't fully exonerate him either. After the coup, Paul was placed in British custody almost immediately and transported, via Greece, to Kenya. Worth holding on to, the power that detained him for years was not Nazi Germany rewarding an ally. It was Britain. The country Yugoslavia was widely seen as belonging alongside, treating him as, at best, a dangerously compromised figure, and at worst, a political risk to the Allied cause. If Paul had truly been a committed Axis collaborator, it's a fair question why Germany didn't shelter him, and why it's Britain that kept him confined for years. The case against Paul rests primarily on the tripartite pact itself. By signing with Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan, he legitimized and empowered the Axis at a moment when resistance, however costly, might have sent a different signal to the rest of occupied Europe. That's a real historical argument made by real historians, and it deserves to be stated as such. The case in his defense rests on the strategic reality he was working with in March 1941. Yugoslavia's military, by most assessments, stood essentially no realistic chance against a determined German invasion. Paul had watched neighboring states fall one after another, and his own advisors, including senior military figures, reportedly told him directly that armed resistance would likely mean rapid, total defeat with no meaningful strategic gain, a worse outcome in their assessment than a pact that preserved the appearance of Yugoslav sovereignty and kept German troops out, for the time being. Under this reading, Paul's decision wasn't ideological sympathy with fascism, but a grim, unpopular attempt at damage control by a man who'd never wanted the job and was making the least bad choice available in an impossible situation. Serious historians still disagree on which framing is correct, and this documentary isn't going to manufacture false certainty on a genuinely contested question. What's clearer is how Paul's reputation developed afterward. For years after the war, he was widely treated, in the West and especially inside communist Yugoslavia, as a straightforward villain, the regent who sold out his country. That framing served multiple interests. It gave the Allies a clean narrative of a government corrupted from within, before being heroically overthrown, and it gave Tito's communist government an even more useful one, proof the entire pre-war royal establishment had been rotten, justifying its total abolition. Paul spent the rest of his life largely out of public relevance, living first in colonial exile and then in Western Europe, never returning to Yugoslavia, never formally rehabilitated in his own lifetime. He died in 1976, in Paris, still carrying, in most accounts, the reputation of a man who had failed his country at its most critical moment. Only in recent decades, specifically as part of the broader post-communist reconsideration of Yugoslav royal history that eventually produced the 2012-2013 repatriation, did Paul's reputation begin receiving more careful, less politically motivated treatment. That's why his family's eventual reburial at Oplenac carries different weight than Peter II's. Peter's story is relatively straightforward: a young king who lost his throne to an invasion he didn't provoke. Paul's story is not straightforward, and Serbia, in burying him with the same honors as the king he was accused of betraying, made a far more complicated statement than it made with Peter's reburial, one not everyone in Serbia agrees with even today. What's certain, whatever you conclude about the underlying decision, is what came next for Paul personally. Total removal from public life, decades treated as a footnote of shame rather than a subject of serious debate, and no chance within his own lifetime to see that verdict reconsidered. The reconsideration, when it finally came, would happen entirely posthumously, decided by a state that had spent most of the intervening decades making sure nobody was even allowed to discuss him at all, which brings us to that erasure itself. By November of 1945, the war was over, and Josip Broz Tito's communist-led partisan movement held effective control of the state. That same month, a newly elected Constituent Assembly, under conditions that gave opposition parties essentially no realistic path to power, formally abolished the Yugoslav monarchy and declared the country a republic. King Peter II, still in exile in Britain and still, in the eyes of much of the world, the internationally recognized head of the Yugoslav state, was never permitted to return, never given a referendum, never formally consulted. The monarchy simply ended, by decree, while its king was still alive, still in his 20s, still watching from abroad. An entire 800-year royal tradition, tracing back to the medieval Serbian kingdom and more immediately to the Karađorđević dynasty's founding, after the 1804 uprising, was ended not by popular vote or military defeat, but by a single legislative act carried out by a government that had already secured a monopoly on power through wartime military dominance. What followed wasn't just institutional, it was personal, and often violent. Individuals and families with documented royalist sympathies faced real persecution, property confiscation, imprisonment, and in a significant number of cases execution, particularly in the immediate post-war years as Tito's government consolidated control. Public expression of monarchist support became not just discouraged but, in practical terms, dangerous. School children in socialist Yugoslavia grew up without access to an accurate, uncensored account of the royal family's history. Official narratives framed the pre-war monarchy as an era of backwardness and eventual national betrayal, culminating in Paul's pact with the Axis, which the state found politically convenient to emphasize because it discredited the entire pre-war royal system by association. Peter II lived out the rest of his life almost entirely disconnected from the country he had briefly, if nominally, ruled, never setting foot in Yugoslavia again after 1941. The state that had once been his to govern had, by formal legal act, declared that he and his entire family line no longer had a place in it. How effective was this erasure, really? Officially, extremely, for nearly half a century, open royalist sentiment was suppressed and the monarchy written out of state-sanctioned history in any positive light. But there's a difference between official erasure and actual erasure. Private memory doesn't disappear just because public expression of it is criminalized. Royalist sympathy, particularly among older generations and within the Serbian Orthodox Church, which maintained its own institutional memory largely independent of state ideology, persisted quietly throughout the communist decades, even when it couldn't be expressed openly. The church would turn out to be an important thread connecting the pre-war monarchy to its eventual, much later rehabilitation. The same church that would preside over the 2013 state funerals had never fully abandoned its historical relationship with the family, even when acknowledging that relationship publicly carried real risk. So the erasure was real, and enforced with real state power for the better part of 5 decades, but it was never as total as the decree suggested. And the fact that it wasn't total is exactly what would eventually make reconciliation possible. Those conditions would take almost 50 years to shift. In the meantime, an entire generation of Karađorđević would live and die never having been allowed home. For the family, the abstract legal fact of abolition translated into a much lonelier reality, statelessness, spread across several continents for decades. Peter II remained in Britain through the immediate post-war years, still formally recognized by some Western governments as head of a government in exile, even after Tito's regime consolidated control inside Yugoslavia, an increasingly symbolic position with no actual territory, as most Western governments quietly shifted toward formal recognition of communist Yugoslavia instead. He eventually relocated to the United States, settling near Los Angeles, where he attempted, with limited success, to build a life in a country with no institutional obligation to support a deposed foreign monarch. Documented accounts describe genuine financial hardship, a stark contrast to the vast pre-war wealth of the Yugoslav crown, and a detail that captures something important about what exile actually costs, beyond the loss of formal political power. Peter II died in 1970 in Denver, Colorado, at 47, following complications from a liver transplant. He never returned to Yugoslavia, not even for a visit, in the 29 years between his 1941 flight and his death. He was buried at St. Sava Serbian Orthodox Monastery in Libertyville, Illinois, a distinction that still stands. He remains, to this day, the only European monarch ever buried on American soil. There was, quite literally, nowhere else in the world that made more institutional sense to lay him to rest than a monastery in the American Midwest, thousands of miles from the throne he'd briefly held. Prince Paul lived out his own post-war exile primarily in Western Europe after his years of British-controlled confinement in Kenya ended, settling eventually in Paris, where he died in 1976, 6 years after Peter. He, too, never returned to Yugoslavia, and died with his reputation still largely frozen in the wartime framing that treated him, without much nuance, as a discredited figure. The scale of what exile meant for this family across multiple generations is worth sitting with. An entire generation of Karađorđević, Peter II, his mother Queen Maria, his wife Queen Alexandra, his brother Prince Andrei, and Paul's branch of the family alongside them, lived out their natural lives, never once setting foot in the country their family had ruled for generations. Children born into this family in exile grew up with Serbia as an inherited memory rather than a lived experience, and for decades there was no realistic expectation this would ever change. Tito's Yugoslavia remained stable, communist, and firmly closed to any royalist reconsideration for the entirety of his rule, which lasted until he died in 1980. Even after that, Yugoslavia continued as a one-party communist state for another decade, with no institutional appetite for reopening the question of the monarchy it had spent nearly half a century actively suppressing. If you had asked, in 1985, whether any Karađorđević would ever be formally welcomed back into Serbia with state honors, the honest answer would have been, almost certainly not. The family members who had actually lived through the original exile, Peter II, Paul, their spouses, were by that point already dead. The reconciliation this story is building toward did not come in time for the people who actually lived through the original trauma of exile. Peter II never lived to see Serbia again. Neither did Paul. Whatever came later, the political thaw, the family's eventual return, the state funerals, came only for their descendants and only for their remains. That's the actual shape of what erasure by decree costs a family, not just decades, but entire lifetimes that never got the chance to see whether reconciliation was even possible. But something was about to change, not for Peter or Paul themselves, but for the country they'd been forced to leave, and eventually, for what that country was willing to do about the family members who came after them. The system that had made a Karađorđević return to Serbia unthinkable didn't collapse gradually. It came apart with genuine speed, specifically because the larger structure holding it in place, communist Yugoslavia itself, was disintegrating. Tito died in 1980, removing the single unifying figure who had held the country's competing ethnic and regional tensions in check for over 3 decades. Through the 1980s, those tensions resurfaced, and by the early 1990s, Yugoslavia was violently disintegrating into separate states along largely ethnic lines, accompanied by brutal, internationally documented armed conflict in Croatia, Bosnia, and later Kosovo. It's genuinely strange that the same period that produced some of the most devastating violence in post-war European history is also the period that cracked open the door for the royal family's return. But the connection isn't a coincidence, it's cause and effect. As communist Yugoslavia broke apart, so did the ideological framework that had justified erasing the monarchy in the first place. Serbia, now a smaller, more ethnically homogeneous state than the Yugoslavia the Karađorđević had once ruled, began revisiting parts of its pre-communist history that had been off-limits for decades. The specific opening came under Slobodan Milosevic's government in the mid-1990s. It's important to be precise here, because Milosevic's government presided over some of the most internationally condemned actions of the Yugoslav wars, and framing him as a benevolent gatekeeper who simply let the royals back in would distort a messier reality. What actually happened is narrower and more transactional, seeking domestic legitimacy and international goodwill at a moment when Serbia was increasingly isolated because of the wars in Bosnia and Croatia. Milosevic's government permitted Crown Prince Alexander II, Peter II's son, born in London in 1945, the same year the monarchy was formally abolished, to visit and eventually reside in Serbia, restoring a limited, symbolic royal presence for the first time in over 50 years. Alexander II had spent his entire life in exile, born literally on the day of his family's greatest institutional defeat, raised and educated abroad, and trained for a throne he would, by any realistic assessment, likely never actually occupy. His return in the 1990s wasn't a restoration of the monarchy. Serbia did not become a kingdom again, and no serious political movement has come close to restoring the crown to functional power. What it was, instead, was the reopening of a door formerly sealed since 1945, a Karađorđević permitted to live in Serbia again, publicly, without fear of arrest, for the first time in his life. Over the following years, Alexander II and his family established a more settled presence, engaging in charitable work, donating medical equipment to underfunded hospitals, supporting orphanages, and positioning the family less as a political movement seeking restoration and more as a respected cultural and philanthropic institution, one that could coexist with Serbia's republican system rather than threaten it. That distinction mattered, because they were not, by the 2000s, presenting themselves as a political threat. They were presenting themselves as a historical institution seeking recognition, not power. By the early 2000s, following Milosevic's fall and Serbia's broader turn toward European integration, the family's position had normalized considerably further, an arrangement that would have been entirely unthinkable to Peter II or Paul, both of whom had died still barred from the country decades earlier. What hadn't happened yet was the piece that would eventually close the loop this story opened with, the actual physical return of the family members who had died in exile. Alexander II could live in Serbia. He could not yet bring his own father home. That final step, the exhumations, the transcontinental transport of remains, the state funerals with military honors, was still years away, and it would require a Serbian government willing to formally stake its own institutional credibility on completing a reconciliation that had started, tentatively, almost 2 decades earlier. By 2012, the government making that decision was led by President Tomislav Nikolić and Prime Minister Ivica Dačić, and the project they undertook was substantial, a coordinated, multi-country operation to exhume and repatriate the remains of several generations of Karađorđević scattered across the United States, Britain, Greece, and Switzerland, and bring them together for reburial in the family's historical crypt. The first phase focused on King Peter II and his immediate family. Over the course of 2012 into early 2013, Peter II's remains were exhumed from the monastery in Libertyville, Illinois, where he'd lain for over 4 decades. Alongside him, the remains of Queen Alexandra, his wife, Queen Maria, his mother, and Prince Andrei, his brother, were exhumed from their resting places in the United Kingdom and Greece, an operation logistically complex precisely because this family's exile had scattered them across so many jurisdictions over so many decades. On the 26th of May 2013, those 4 coffins were carried into St. George's Church at Oplenac, the historic royal mausoleum in Topola, central Serbia, where more than 20 other members of the dynasty are already interred. The ceremony was attended by senior state officials, including President Nikolić, alongside Serbian Orthodox Patriarch Irinej, and broadcast live on state television, a deliberate, public act of institutional reconciliation, not a private family matter conducted out of the public eye. Crown Prince Alexander II described the moment as one that finally allowed the family to be laid to rest among their family and among their Serbs, after wanderings and exile that had lasted for too long. Patriarch Irinej framed the reburial explicitly as correcting a historical injustice, describing it as rectifying a wrong that had cried to the heavens, language that positioned the Church, not just the state, as an active participant in this reconciliation. The second phase, involving Prince Paul, Princess Olga, and their son Prince Nikola, followed a similar pattern but from a different starting point. Their remains were exhumed from a cemetery in Lausanne, Switzerland, where the family had lived for decades in exile. They too were eventually reburied at Oplenac, and Paul's daughter Jelisaveta, who had campaigned for years to see her father's remains and reputation brought home, was present, describing his return as the fulfillment of what she said had been his only real wish throughout his exile, to be buried in his own country. Worth naming honestly, available reporting on the exact date of the Paul, Olga, and Nikola reburial is inconsistent, with different accounts placing it in 2012 and others in 2013. What's consistently documented is that it happened, followed the same essential format as the May 2013 ceremony, was attended by senior state officials, including President Nikolić, and took place at Oplenac. The precise date isn't something we're going to manufacture false precision around. That's a reflection of a genuine gap in public documentation, not an error on our part. What's not in question is the overall significance of what Serbia did across both ceremonies. This was a state, operating through its highest offices and its national church simultaneously, formally reversing a nearly 70-year-old institutional verdict, the 1945 decree that had abolished the monarchy and declared this family unwelcome in its own country. Bringing Peter II home corrected what is, by most historical accounts, a relatively uncomplicated injustice, a young king who lost his throne to an invasion he didn't provoke. Bringing Paul home is more complicated because it required the Serbian state to essentially decide that 7 decades of traitor framing had been, if not entirely wrong, at least drastically oversimplified, a genuinely contested judgment not every historian or every Serbian citizen agrees with even now. Hold on to this. A 2013 opinion poll conducted around the time of these ceremonies found roughly 40% of respondents favored possibly restoring a Serbian monarchy, while roughly 32% opposed it, numbers that suggest real, active public disagreement, not consensus, on what this family's legacy should mean for modern Serbia. Reburying the dead with honors is a different act than resolving, for good, exactly what those honors are meant to say. So we're back to the funeral we opened with, coffins carried into a hilltop church by a government that once made this family's name unspeakable. The bodies came home. The argument over what they represent did not entirely come with them. Some historical verdicts can be formally reversed by state decree, others simply stay open, generation after generation, regardless of where the dead are finally laid to rest. If this story stuck with you, hit subscribe for more of this kind of history, and drop a comment. We'd genuinely like to know what you think Serbia's decision says about how nations deal with their past.